After UK authorities detained the partner of journalist Glenn Greenwald in connection with the NSA surveillance story, there's been an increased focus on the role of the media and the public good. Our next guest says the time is now for journalism to become more activist. With us now for more on that, in New York, Jay Rosen. He's professor of journalism at NYU and he blogs at pressthink.org. Jay, it's good to have you on the program. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Steve.
Let's set this up a bit and then I'll have you fill in the blanks, because back in August, the partner of Glenn Greenwald, his name is David Miranda, was detained at Heathrow Airport by British authorities for 9 hours. Pick up the story. What happened?
Well, David Miranda was detained under a terrorism statute in the UK that allows the government to stop people in order to stop terrorism. He was held for 9 hours. He was not allowed access to his own lawyer, although they offered him one of their lawyers, which he declined. They confiscated all of his technology, which included some devices and some thumb drives. And they forced him to reveal the passwords to his devices so they could examine him. And then as they ran up against the limit of the law for how long they could hold him without going to a court, they released him after 9 hours, and he was able to fly on to Brazil, which was his destination in the first place.
So what was he doing in Heathrow in the first place?
He was changing planes on his way from Berlin, where he had visited Greenwald's collaborator, to Rio, where he lives with Greenwald. So he was simply changing planes in Heathrow.
And he's not Greenwald, obviously. He's Greenwald's partner. So why did the British authorities think to detain him?
Well, they suspected that he might be acting as a courier between Greenwald's partner in Berlin, who's putting together a film based on the Snowden revelations, and Greenwald, who's been doing a lot of the writing and reporting for The Guardian. And they wanted to intercept, perhaps, what he was carrying. They may have wanted to disrupt The Guardian's work on the story. They may have wanted to send a message. One thing we know they weren't doing was stopping terrorism, because nobody thinks David Miranda was actually engaged in anything like that.
Well, one of the things you did write is, quote, the surveillance state is going after journalism the same way it goes after terrorism. Help explain that if you would. How so?
Well, first of all, the surveillance state refers not just to the UK government or the United States National Security Agency, but really all the Western governments that collaborate and cooperate in monitoring worldwide communications, storing the content of phone calls and internet communications, and sharing information with each other, as well as keeping everything secret. And just like the surveillance state wants to make terrorism more difficult by forcing people who might be affiliated with terror networks to use slower, more expensive, and less secure means of communication, the surveillance state is forcing journalists like Greenwald to use slower, more expensive, and less secure means of communication to simply get in the way or throw sand in the gears of the process of putting these stories out.
Now, I think one of the interesting things that has happened as a result of all this has been the reaction of, I guess I'm limiting these comments to the mainstream media, which have come down like a ton of bricks on Greenwald, on Miranda, on all of this. They seem to be taking the state side as opposed to the journalist side. And I wonder what your view is of that.
Well, I think it's more of a split within the establishment press, really. There are some very prominent journalists in the U.S., including David Gregory of NBC, Jeffrey Toobin of CNN, Thomas Friedman of the New York Times, Richard Cohen of the Washington Post, who have expressed hostility and dramatic skepticism about either Snowden or Greenwald. But there are also many journalists who are colleagues of theirs who really understand that people like Greenwald and Snowden are on the same side as some of the most heroic and honored investigative journalists in those newsrooms. And so it's more of a split within the profession than it is mainstream media against bloggers, which is a conflict that we might have seen earlier in the digital era. And that's, I think, part of what makes this story so interesting, is that we've learned that some journalists identify more with the secret makers and secret keepers than they do with the whistleblowers, sources, and journalists who are uncovering this fantastic story about their surveillance state.
Well, I must confess that Jeffrey Toobin at CNN, I think, likened David Miranda to a drug mule, and that caught my attention perhaps more than those who were supportive. Do you think there's any, is there any place for calling him a drug mule in this?
No, I don't think so. He was being paid by The Guardian to fly materials between journalists who were working on a story. In television, they often call those people fixers. They help out with a story, even though they are not themselves the reporter. They're often very important to the work that gets done. And Jeffrey Toobin was just expressing his contempt for Greenwald, for Snowden, and for the entire story when he said drug mules and used that very unfortunate phrase.
Now, let me push back on you a bit as well when you talk about Snowden as a whistleblower from a fine tradition of whistleblowers, if you like. I've also seen commentary which suggests that this guy is no Daniel Ellsberg. Ellsberg leaked the Pentagon Papers, he stuck around, he faced the music, he ended up in a courtroom, and at the end of the day, I guess history has painted him as more heroic than not. Snowden has gone into hiding, and he's now in Russia, which is a pretty different approach to all of this than what Daniel Ellsberg took. That's a fair point, isn't it?
Well, it's fair to argue about whether one considers Snowden a whistleblower, a hero, a creep, a traitor. I understand why we have those arguments, and they can be conducted in good faith. However, it's very important to understand that Snowden is being charged under the Espionage Act in the United States, one of the most odious and draconian laws we have on the books, in many ways the worst law we have on the books. And under the Espionage Act, it is not possible for a defendant to even present an argument that what they leaked was in the public interest. They cannot present an argument about their motivations. They cannot, for example, try to show to a jury that their leak did more good than harm. They are actually prevented from mounting any kind of case like that at all, which is why Daniel Ellsberg has said that Snowden could never have the same experience that he had, and he understands why he fled abroad. And so when you look at what Snowden is actually charged with and what the law permits and does not permit, I think the analogy falls apart.
Okay. We've been talking on this program about finding that sweet spot between respecting national security procedures while at the same time having transparency and openness and therefore legitimacy of these programs. And I wonder from a journalistic point of view, maybe you could help us on this. What sort of thinking needs to go into determining what gets published and what ought not to be published?
Well, I think it's important first to understand that Edward Snowden's instructions to Barton Gellman of the Washington Post and to Glenn Greenwald of The Guardian were to only publish those parts of the story that they determined were important and in the public interest, and to only publish those parts of the story that would not injure national security or lead to the deaths of innocent people. Secondly, both the Washington Post and The Guardian consult with the governments, including the governments of the UK and the United States, before they publish sensitive material. They listen to the arguments of the government, and in many cases they have held back material that they didn't think should be in the public interest. Third, I think it's important for journalists working on stories like this to actually think through why the material they're exposing should be in the public domain. And for example, consent of the governed and the whole concept of an informed public requires that people know enough about what their government is doing that they can indeed consent. When every telephone call in the United States is being collected by the surveillance state, and the government has a line into the internet companies so that 75% of the internet traffic is being monitored by the surveillance state, those are policies that the American people never consented to. They didn't even know that they were in place. When secret interpretations of the law permit the government to judge as relevant 100% of the phone calls in the United States, those are things that ought to be in the public domain, because if they are not, we have no idea if the government is operating with our consent. And so I think it's arguments like that that have to lay behind the publication of secrets in order to demonstrate that not everything should be published. There are legitimate national secrets, and I think that is exactly how the Washington Post and the Guardian have behaved.
Jay, in our last 30 seconds here, this trend towards activist journalism, you like it?
Well, I think it's certainly valid for journalists to work with different kinds of commitments. Some will want to demonstrate that they have no stake, they have no view, they have no interest, they have no opinion. Others are going to want to generate trust by showing this is where we are coming from. And I think both forms are valid. By the way, Steve, let me ask you, has the Canadian press picked up on the surveillance state stories at all and done the kind of job you would like to see them do?
Those are two different questions. The first question, absolutely yes. The second question, we're going to leave to the next time we have you on the program. Okay, Jay?
Fair enough.
Okay, that's Professor of Journalism from NYU, Jay Rosen, joining us on the line from New York. You can read him at pressthink.org. Jay, thanks so much for joining us tonight.
My pleasure.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.